Science fiction in particular has always taken advantage of its genre, presenting visions of the future to express concerns about our current times. It can be a very explicit allegory or even a vague suggestion, but usually these distorted visions of mankind and where it's going has a clear enough intention with its art. Or, at least you have something worth debating. Present science fiction combined with horror, and the concerns transform into fear and dread. Present the story without an author, and the origin of its intent becomes a mystery. That's where we get the curious case of Alien 3 and the AIDS crisis. AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is the most severe stage of HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. This virus attacks cells that help the body fight infection, making a person more vulnerable to other infections and diseases. Since the beginning of the epidemic, over 40 million lives have been claimed due to HIV and AIDS-related illnesses. There's much we know about the virus today and how to treat it, with many diagnosed being able to live long lives, but it wasn't always this way. During the most devastating years of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, the disease remained mysterious to the public since its first reported cases in 1981. There were many misconceptions of how it could spread, and who it could spread to. While we know today that it is mainly sexually transmitted, and any gender or sexual orientation can be infected, there was a belief among many that only gay men could get it. It was also feared that just being in close contact with someone who had AIDS could spread it to you. It took years to dispel such beliefs, and in large parts, those with influence on the world stage took it upon themselves to act. You may recall the famous photo of Princess Diana with an AIDS patient, showing to the world that close contact would not, in fact, cause infection. Opposite to that, people were heavily critical of the Reagan administration and what appeared to be a refusal to do anything about the crisis, let alone acknowledge it. The gay community felt isolated, left without a government that cared or wanted to help, left to their own devices, their own support systems, contact tracing. Left essentially to become infected and to die for all the world seemed to care. Further to that, there were more than a few very vocal groups on the world stage who proclaimed that they deserved it, and that this plague was God's will. Those suffering from AIDS were seen as the worst of the worst. They were cast out. They could only rely on each other and their own little world that they had to form. This was something many seemed to recognize being reflected in Alien 3. The prisoners of Fiorina Fury 161, all men, all the worst of the worst, cast out from society, had to build their own world on the planet. The rest of the universe may as well not even exist as far as they were concerned, and they could all only rely on each other. Their world would become tested to the limit when the presence of an infection disrupted their way of life in the form of the alien. Another comparison was made to the alien parasite itself and its unique life cycle. The alien, as we know, grows inside the human body. The infection takes over the DNA of its host. AIDS in relation infects the blood, attacking the immune system. And there's something to say of the particular way the alien infects the host. When the facehugger attaches itself, it's very much a sexual act, though not literally, but certainly symbolically, and reflects the sexual transmission of HIV. It's also very interesting to see the film play out and recognize that the first death of the film, Murphy, in the vent shaft, is juxtaposed with the sex scene between Ripley and Clemens. The sex scene takes place off-screen, of course, but this is the first time in an Alien movie that sex takes place between two characters, and with it comes death. It seems a very striking element to the movie and its themes that sex and death would be so closely intertwined. Hardly a new theme to be explored, especially in horror movies, but within the lens of viewing it as an AIDS allegory, this is an especially noticeable incident. Murphy, though, technically isn't the first death to take place amongst the inhabitants of Fury 161. That fate would belong to Spike, the dog, or if you're watching the special edition, Babe the ox. It's widely accepted that AIDS originated from an animal, specifically monkeys, and passed its way to humans. This is the first time in an Alien movie we saw a host from the xenomorph other than a human. It's very interesting that the origin of this beast would also come from an animal, just as AIDS did. With this connection in mind, the comparisons tend to glare all the stronger. Ripley's debilitating health throughout the film, and the ultimate tragic diagnosis that shatters her world. The imagery of the bald men, like visions of afflicted patients. The Weyland YUTANI commandos at the end of the film, clothed from head to toe in protective gear, evoking imagery of early AIDS wards. The character Clemens, an admitted intravenous drug user, also another prominent way people were being infected with the virus, and the very intense close-ups on the image of a needle going into a vein. The most memorable of these images taking place right before Clemens is killed. There really could be something here. There could be a connection, and maybe an intentional one. Mind you, this is not exactly a new theory, so before you accuse this as being an appraisal made in hindsight or some kind of revisionist interpretation, there were many who noticed this comparison right away. Most notably may be from the film critic Peter Travers, who was one of the few major critics at the time to favor the film with a positive review. He seemed to key into it upon his assessment of the film. Here's what he wrote in 1992. If Ridley Scott's Alien had more surprises, and James Cameron's Aliens more thrills, David Fincher's austere, low-tech, darkly funny Alien 3 has more sharply observed characters. The script, reflecting the struggle of 9 writers, even has a subtext. This must be the first $50 million thriller that also functions as an AIDS allegory. Officer Ripley, Sigourney Weaver, crash lands on Fury 161, an all-male religious colony inhabited by celibate former convicts. No rubbers, no women, no guns, no shit, says Dylan, Charles S. Dutton, the group's leader. Quick note, Mr. Travers is paraphrasing here, and he mistakenly attributes the quote to Dylan when it was actually delivered by Danny Webb's character, Morse. Ripley's fellow passengers, including the young girl she protected in Aliens, are dead. Is there an alien inside the dead child? Ripley demands that Medical Officer Clemens, the excellent Charles Dance, perform an autopsy. At first, the convicts don't believe Ripley's talk of doom. Then the unwelcome virus starts taking casualties. Vincent Ward, who devised the story, directed The Navigator, a 1988 film about another plague. But Alien 3, beset by studio interference, sometimes loses sight of its larger theme to provide the usual jolts. The compromise isn't fatal. Fincher, 29, makes a feature directing debut that goes beyond the sleek panache he showed in his Madonna videos. Though he borrows from Kubrick's 2001 and Cameron's Terminator 2, Fincher gives the images new resonance, creating a provocative fusion of suspense and feeling. Weaver is in spectacular form. Unarmed and nearly bald, she's never seemed more resourcefully human. Her final scene, a war between her maternal and killer instincts, is bold and haunting. So is the movie. In the years to follow, curiosity would continue to grow about Alien 3 and its connection to the AIDS crisis. Many have written on the subject, but one particular article I wanted to focus on comes from Terry Mesnard of Dread Central. The article, Bodies to the Void, Alien 3 and the Devastation of the AIDS Epidemic, contains further allusions and more in-depth connections to the affected community during the era. Mesnard notes Ripley's insistence to have the bodies of Hicks and Newt cremated, comparing it to reports that people with AIDS were more than twice as likely to be cremated upon their deaths at the time. Ripley's own death is discussed, and her eventual decision to take her own life at the end being framed as a victory. A New York Times article from 1985 examined a similar scenario playing out at New York's Bellevue Hospital Center, Mesnard writes, where patients wanted to forego invasive treatments and instead wanted to die with dignity. It's this stylistic choice that Ripley makes. The article also makes mention of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a grassroots organization designed to give a voice to a community of silenced and dying people. This organization created an art collective used to spread awareness about AIDS and quash the prevalent misconceptions. One piece in particular highlighted a disconcerting statistic from New York City at the time. 1 in 61 babies in New York City is born with AIDS or born HIV antibody positive. 161. An eyebrow-raising coincidence, though it could be just that. Or it could be an audience searching for a meaning. Either way, they found it. It brings up the age-old debate of an author's intention versus the audience interpretation. Can a piece of art's message be realized through the public's reaction to it, regardless of the artist's original intention, if they strictly had one to begin with? Alien 3 wouldn't be the first time the fear and dread of science fiction horror has been interpreted as an AIDS allegory during these years. Take, for example, John Carpenter's 1982 film The Thing. A group of men, isolated in an outpost in Antarctica, come into contact with an alien parasite that specifically infects the blood. One of the standout moments of the film is the blood test scene, where the surviving men each offer samples of their blood and wait, filled with tension, to see who may be infected. John Carpenter has acknowledged this interpretation and has appreciation for it, but stated very clearly it was not his intention to make such a connection. There's also David Cronenberg's The Fly, a 1986 film about a reclusive scientist's sexual awakening that happens to coincide with an experiment going terribly wrong. An unwanted outside force takes over his body, in this case a fly which had found its way into a teleportation pod during a hasty test and fused together their DNA. He becomes increasingly unrecognizable throughout the movie, as if it's a terminal illness attacking all of his cells. Cronenberg has also acknowledged this interpretation, and has also claimed that an AIDS allegory was not the intention. The problem we're left with when it comes to Alien 3, naturally, is that there's really no singular artist that can take credit for the film or confirm this allegory as intended or not. David Fincher has long since disowned the film, and to this day rarely talks about it. Several writers came and went during the years of its pre-production all the way to its actual production, making screenplay contributions. Maybe the most obvious of influences was standing in front of the camera the entire time. Sigourney Weaver was an executive producer on this third film with creative input on the story. This may have been something she wanted to get across in this $50 million allegory. Weaver was and is a supporter of the theater, staying within that world despite starring in these big blockbusters. This particular facet of the entertainment industry was struck especially hard during the pandemic of the 80s. There were people Weaver knew in her personal and professional life afflicted with AIDS. One was Way Bandy, a celebrated makeup artist who had worked with Weaver during her publicity tour for Aliens and passed away later that year. Vanity Fair covered a tribute to Bandy in a 1987 article, One by One, an AIDS memoriam. Weaver spoke at the event, and the article describes the scene. After the tributes, guests sip champagne and trade reminiscences. One of the more pensive among them is the actress Sigourney Weaver. She describes how she was away in Europe for a year and a half and returned to learn that 2 friends had died untended and alone. There is still too much turning away from this subject, she says, as if it affects only special clusters of the population. But AIDS is here to test all of us, our love, our character, our commitment. Weaver has never gone on record about any connection Alien 3 may have to AIDS, but actor Ralph Brown, who played Aaron, aka 85, feels it has validity. In 2020, he spoke to Perfect Organism, the excellent alien-related podcast, and shared his thoughts on the deeper meanings of the series. Here's what he had to say. Each film really guides us through American history of the late 20th century. The first film is the Watergate film. It's the company. The company is the enemy, not Russia. And the second film is kind of the end of the empire, really. Reagan goes into Grenada with the entire force of the US military, this tiny little island which really has no army or navy to speak of. And Alien 3 is AIDS. It's inside you. Sigourney Weaver certainly could have had some say in bringing these elements to light, but the allegory could have come from one or multiple voices. Perhaps not intended, but it could be that something was just so strongly in the public consciousness at the time that it made its way into this work on a subconscious level. If that's the case, then it manifested itself into the production of this movie, and the piece of art that emerged went right back into the public who were able to make and own these interpretations. Art can be a curious thing that way. It can reflect our world in many ways, if not by the voice of an author, then by happenstance, shining a light on the voiceless. Do you feel there's any weight to the theory of Alien 3 being an AIDS allegory? Are there any other connections you noticed not mentioned here? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this one, so please leave a comment below. And as always, I'd like to thank you very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave it a like, and be sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up with future videos. A very special thanks goes out to Brandon James, Grizz4756, Ronni Jensen, and XenoShadowMorph, Queen Tiers of the Patreon Hive. Thank you to Gregory Ford and John Griggs, the Hive's Praetorians. A very special thanks goes out to Lady Anne in the Ellen Ripley Tier of Excellence. And of course, in the role of Weyland Yutani executives, Michael Cole, Nicholas Butta, and Wesley A. Weaver Jr. Thank you guys very much. If you'd like to join the Hive and support the channel, check out my Patreon page in the links below. In the meantime, you can catch up with Alien Theory over social media. You can follow @alien_theory on Twitter and @alientheoryyt on Facebook and Instagram for more. And until next time, this is Alien Theory, signing off.